Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. We'll get started in about 1 minute. All right, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where in the country you're at. Welcome to today's webinar, Making Strides 2020, a look at our state report cards. My name is Michelle Lieberman. I am the Consulting and Program Support Director at the Safe Routes Partnership. I'm going to be your webinar moderator today, as well as one of the presenters. We're really excited to have you all with us today as we share our updated state report cards on support for walking, biking, and active kids in communities. If you're not familiar with our organization, we're a national nonprofit. Our mission is to advance safe walking and biking to and from schools and in everyday life, improving the health and well-being of people of all races, income levels, and abilities, and building healthy, thriving communities for everyone. A little bit of GoToWebinar housekeeping. On the left, you'll see the GoToWebinar viewer. This is where you'll see the presentation. On the right is the control panel where you can raise your hand, ask questions, and select the audio mode you'll use. Please note that the control panel will collapse automatically when it's not in use. To keep it open, you can click the View menu and uncheck Auto Hide. There are two options for listening to this today. You can either use your telephone or your computer mic and speakers. If you have sound problems with one selection, I would recommend trying the other option. And we'll do our best to field any issues if you just send us, pop a question into the question box. So even though you're muted today, we really want to hear your input. You can use the question box to ask speakers questions for the Q&A portion that will be at the end of the webinar. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can at the end. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available online. We'll provide the link in a follow-up email so you can refer back to it or share it with colleagues who weren't able to attend today. The link to the webinars will be also on our webpage. You can do this for free by going to saferoutespartnership.org, click on the resource tab heading, and then click on webinars in the list on the left side of the page. All of our past webinars are stored here for your viewing pleasure. So today I'm joined by Margo Pedroso, who is our Deputy Director, and Marisa Jones, our Policy and Partnerships Director. They were both co-authors of this report. We're going to start today by giving an overview of the report and then dive into the four core topic areas and indicators that we looked at in more depth to measure each state's strength in the area. So to give you an overview of the report, why state report cards and how did this project come about? Our overall goal is to provide a snapshot about how supportive each state is in terms of walking, biking, and policy, physical activity policy for children and adults. Our first state report cards were prepared in 2016, and then in 2018, we did an update to those. They continued the assessment of the same core topic areas, provided an update on a number of the same indicators. We also, at that time, expanded what was assessed in the topic areas and added some indicators that we think are really key to understanding the breadth of state-level policy and supports that can be provided. Our 2020 report cards are an update to the 2018 report cards with some changes in how it was organized and some new indicator areas that I'll go into shortly. These report cards acknowledge the strength of each state and let advocates and state governments know about how their state is doing when it comes to policy and other state-level supports for healthy active living opportunities. This project was done in partnership with the Y of USA with funding from CDC. To give you an overview of the contents of the report itself includes a section on the research on why physical activity, walking, and biking matter. There's a discussion of the rationale for state report cards, detailed explanation of the scoring, the indicators, and the core topic areas, and then the report cards themselves. So each state has its own report card. And at the end of the report, we also included some reflections and comparisons to the 2018 report cards. We have maps illustrating key findings, and then you'll find in the appendices some more scoring and grading by state and more scoring details. So if you've been following the report cards since the beginning, you might be interested in understanding what we changed since 2018. We reorganized the core topic areas to separate active transportation funding from safe routes to school funding and support. We also integrated the state physical activity indicators into the active schools and neighborhoods core topic area. We added some indicators related to state active transportation funding, as well as expanded the indicators related to safe routes to school supportive practices. Along the way, we also removed some indicators where data is less available or research has shown diminished significance, and made other minor adjustments to improve the scoring process and data sources. A little reminder of where you can find the report and download it if you haven't already. If you go to our website, saferoutespartnership.org, scroll down to the featured section on our homepage and click on this banner here that says Making Strides 2020. It'll take you to the map that shows the overall scores for each state. If you click on the individual state, you'll get the individual report card, and then there's also the link to the full report. And we also have 2 other fact sheets that I'll talk about that provide quick guides to understanding scoring ideas on how to use your state report card. So to move into a little bit on the scoring, each report card includes a score for 28 separate indicators, which are grouped into 4 core topic areas and subtopics. The indicators look at state policy and implementation of policies or funding. Most of the indicators are scored from 0 to 5 points, 10 points, or 15 points. There are a few indicators where a state could receive a negative score for a really detrimental action. We'll explain those. There are 200 points total possible across all the indicators. We've used asset-based scoring in all of our report cards. Instead of giving a penalizing grade, we chose scoring categories that really focus on progress and opportunities for each state. So these categories are lacing up, warming up, making strides, and building speed. Let's walk through a snapshot of one of the report cards. We'll use Massachusetts as our example, which is one of the states that gives an overall grade of building speed. At the top, you'll see the state, along with the icon and color for their overall score. Plus, you can see how many points were achieved out of 200. For Massachusetts, they're in the building speed icon category, and they scored 150 out of 200 points. Looking down the left side, you'll see underneath that there are the core topic areas, which are in capital letters, the subtopics, and in some cases, and then a short descriptor for each indicator. Over on the right, for the core topic area, there's also a scoring icon and the points earned. For that core topic area, the icon is placed on a scale so you can see at a glance how their score fell against the possible total. Then for each indicator is the points achieved out of the total possible points, with the total points earned for each core topic area at the bottom. To give you an idea of what the country looks like and how it was scored, this map shows the overall grades for each state. There were 13 states in the lacing up grading category, which is the lowest, only 2 in the highest category, building speed. It means that most of the states are in the middle. They have taken some actions to support physical activity and walking and biking, but there's also considerable room for improvement in the core topic areas. Across all states, the actual scores received out of 200 were between 20 and 163 was the highest score. So now we're going to go through each of the core topic areas and describe the indicators and what we looked at in more depth. We're going to start at the beginning with core topic area number 1, complete streets and active transportation policy and planning. So for this section, we're going to look at complete streets and active transportation policy and planning as key arenas for states to demonstrate commitment and support for communities where people are able to get around by walking, biking, and wheeling. We know that state policies, goals, and guidance that promote building streets that are safe for everyone to use and play a crucial role in enabling walking and biking at the local level for transportation as well as recreation. So here's the map that shows the scores for this core topic area. 17 states fell in the lowest category, which is the yellow lacing up. And these are the states that have the potential for most improvement. In the next category, warming up, there are 15 states, followed by 14 states in the making strides, the dark green category, and 5 in the top category, the blue one, building speed. In each of the core topic areas that we'll cover today, we're going to look at a specific state as an example to talk about the different indicators, what the scoring means, and review the areas where the state both excelled and can improve. So for this section, we're going to look closer at Florida, which has a total score of 28 out of a total 45 points, landing it in the second best category, making strides. Shown here is an overview of this core topic area and its two subtopics, complete streets policy, and the other topic of active transportation planning and design. So we're going to first look at the complete streets policies. If you're not familiar with complete streets policies, these are policies that ensure all new construction and renovation of streets create streets that are safe, comfortable, and convenient for everyone using them. And by everyone, we mean people walking and biking, people driving, people riding public transportation, and people of all ages and abilities. So how did we evaluate complete streets policies for the purposes of our report card? First, we looked at if a state had adopted a complete streets policy, and we considered the type of policy in place. We recognize that legislation, we scored this as the stronger of the policy types, followed by Department of Transportation policies. Our reasoning here is that passing complete streets legislation is more permanent and binding. In contrast, Department of Transportation policies are more likely to get specific details on course of action, but may be more easily altered with a change in department leadership. So second, we looked at the strength of complete streets policies using the National Complete Streets Coalition's system for measuring strength of policies. Their system includes 10 elements using a scoring rubric with a maximum of 100 points. So we converted their score to our point system, which had 20 points maximum. So you can see here, Florida has both a DOT policy and legislation, so it received full points for the first indicator, and then Florida's policy strength scored 8 out of 20 points. So there's a lot of room for improvement here. Next, we looked at indicators related to planning and design for active transportation. We looked at whether a state has published goals to increase walking and biking. These goals are public commitments to progress and provide accountability. They're often found within a bicycle pedestrian plan, a sustainability plan, a highway safety plan, or other statewide plan. Florida has goals to increase both walking and biking, so it received full points. Then we looked at whether a state has adopted a state pedestrian, bicycle, or active transportation plan. These plans are ways that states create a planning foundation that allows both state agencies as well as regional and local partners to coordinate on supporting prioritized projects, policies, and programs. Florida got 10 points here. They've adopted both bicycle and pedestrian master plans. Last in the subtopic, we looked at whether the state had adopted or endorsed the NACDO guides, specifically the Urban Street Design Guide and the Urban Bikeway Design Guide that you'll see here on the bottom right. These guides outline recommendations for building bicycle and pedestrian-friendly facilities and really emphasize using time-tested principles and creating supportive streets in communities. So without the endorsement of these guides, oftentimes cities, towns, and state road engineers lack the flexibility to make roads safe or comfortable for walking and biking. And also note that these are not just for urban states. We see places like Minnesota and Utah where there may be a large city or two that are also adopting the guidelines. Unfortunately, in this indicator, Florida got 0 points out of the possible because it has not endorsed the Urban Bikeway or Urban Street Design Guidelines. I'll wrap up this core topic area by looking at some overall outcomes and trends since the 2018 report. For complete streets policies, there have been a couple of additions since 2018. There's now 36 states that have a complete streets policy of some sort. 8 states have both legislation and a DOT policy. 10 states have a complete streets policy as legislation only, and 18 states have a policy that's a DOT policy only. Unfortunately, overall, we saw that the strength of these complete streets policies scored fairly low. The average was 11 points out of 20 points. So there's a lot of room for improvement, for each state to improve their complete streets policy. And then looking at the indicators for active transportation planning and design, walking and biking goals, we saw only 15 states had goals for increasing both walking and biking, and 3 states had goals for increasing one but not the other. This number dropped considerably since 2018, and we think it might be that as state staff were self-reporting this information, they may have realized that the states have goals that generally talk about walking and biking, but aren't explicitly saying the state is going to set out to increase walking and biking. So that may be a little bit part of the change. Looking at bicycle and pedestrian plans, 31 states have a bicycle or pedestrian plan. The majority include both. This is a lower number than 2018. Some of the plans are getting older and are out of date. We know some states are in the process of updating their plans. And finally, the NACTO guides. 7 states have endorsed or adopted both. 5 states have endorsed or adopted one. And this hasn't changed since 2018. So now I'm going to pass it over to Margo to talk about the federal and state active transportation funding.
Great, thank you, Michelle. So in core topic area 2 here, we look at federal and state active transportation funding. And we look at how a state uses its federally allocated funding for biking and walking and how much state funding has been put towards walking and rolling. So on the federal front, each state gets federal dollars to spend on biking and walking, but state departments of transportation, or DOTs, have a lot of discretion in whether and how they use those dollars. The choices that each state DOT makes about staffing, which projects they fund, and how quickly funding gets out the door has a direct impact on whether or not communities are able to make timely improvements for active transportation. And that's what we look at in this section. In addition, new this year, we're also examining the levels of funding a state puts towards active transportation using its own resources. And you'll see from the map above that the distribution across the categories is fairly even. 12 states fall into the lowest lacing up category, 16 states are in the warming up category, 10 are in the making strides category, and 13 are in the top building speed category. So we will look at Minnesota for this section, and for the federal and state active transportation funding section, they landed in the second best category, which is making strides, with a total of 48 points out of 70. So they're doing a lot of great work in getting money out the door, but there are areas where we could see them improving. As you can see, there are 2 subtopics in this area, and we'll go over each in a little more detail in the following slides. So in the first portion of the federal funding, we score states for how they are implementing the Federal Transportation Alternatives Program, otherwise known as TAP. This section is identical to the 2018 report cards, other than a couple of tweaks to how we allocate points within the indicators. Hopefully you're familiar with the TAP program, but if you aren't, it was created by Congress back in 2012 when they merged together 3 separate programs that originally supported safe routes to school, biking, and walking. And states get anywhere from $2 to $80 million a year from TAP, and it's a really primary federal source of funding for active transportation projects and programs. The federal government makes the funding available to states, but it's up to state DOTs to actually hold the competition and make the funds available to locals. And the 3 indicators I've put into that yellow box there on your screen assess 3 key steps in turning TAP funding into actual sidewalks, crosswalks, trails, and other infrastructure kind of on the ground in local communities. So the first thing we're looking at is transfers. Federal law allows states to transfer up to half of their TAP money away from biking and walking to spend it on road and bridge and other transportation projects. We discourage states from doing this as it diverts money away from active transportation. So in this category, they can score 10 points if they keep all of their TAP funding for biking and walking. They could actually get a negative score if they're transferring money away. Minnesota got a 5 out of 10 here because they do transfer TAP funds, but it's less than 10%. In the second indicator here, we look at awarding projects. States are required to hold a competitive process, allowing local governments, schools, and nonprofit organizations to declare what types of projects they need funding for and to put together an application. Minnesota got a 10 out of 10 here because they've awarded at least 6 years worth of TAP dollars to local communities. And then the final key step here is something called obligation. Obligation is basically the process by which the state actually signs the contract with the local community and kind of helps it get through the regulatory process so that the project can actually get built. And Minnesota got a 10 out of 10 here because they've obligated at least 80% of their TAP dollars. So then moving to the bottom three indicators, again, highlighted in the yellow box. What we're looking here at is how states ensure that funds actually get to the communities where they are most needed. So again, there are three more aspects here that we're looking at. First is whether or not a state is adding equity considerations to how the funding is dispersed. So for example, they might set funding aside for applications from low-income communities or give extra points to applications from Title I schools, for example. And this would be an area we'd identify for improvement in Minnesota as they scored a 0 out of 5 here. And the second indicator looks at the matching funds. TAP only covers about 80% of the cost of a project. And so as you can imagine, low-income and rural communities in particular have a hard time finding enough money as the match to make up the other 20% of the project cost, which can often prevent them from applying. Minnesota gets a 5 out of 5 here because they use state dollars to pay for the matching costs for Safe Routes to School applicants that have a high percentage of low-income students. And then lastly, we look at the support a state provides to applicants, such as hosting workshops to help them understand the application process, or even giving them grant writing assistance. This is particularly important for lower income communities as they often lack engineering or planning staff or grant writers that can write these types of applications. This is another area we'd identify where Minnesota could improve. They scored a 0 out of 5 here as they do not currently offer this type of assistance. And with that, I'm going to hand to my colleague, Marisa, who will review the state funding.
Thanks so much, Margo. So as Margo mentioned, this second section in this indicator assesses the level of state funding available for active transportation. And when we talk about state funding, we're specifically interested in non-federal money that states generate and then spend on walking, biking, and safe routes to school. It's important to note that this is a new indicator for 2020. Within this indicator, we look at three things. If there is state money, how much, and whether the state provides special consideration for high-need communities in spending that state money. I will say that identifying sources of state funding is an imperfect science, as each state does this differently, and generally they braid together a variety of funding sources to pay for walking, biking, and safe routes to school. For the purpose of the report cards, we included any dedicated active transportation funding passed or in place within the past 2 calendar years. And whenever there were states that could clearly summarize their state funding awarded to active transportation projects per year, we also included this funding. And then we looked at whether and how high-need communities were prioritized in the distribution or allocation of state funds. So we'll continue with the example from Minnesota. The state fund section has 25 points available, and Minnesota's doing really well with 18 out of 25 points. So we look at the first consideration here, which is whether there's any funding and if it's ongoing. So this assesses both a binary question, does a state have funding or not, but it also determines whether it's one-time or ongoing funding. And states get points for having any funding at all, but they get the highest number of points for dedicating funding on an ongoing basis, provided that it's over 10 cents per capita. Minnesota's doing great in this regard. They earn all 10 points because they have dedicated funding on an ongoing basis, which really signals their continued commitment to supporting walking and biking. With regard to the amount of funding, so this is calculated on a per capita basis. And we did this in order to provide a meaningful and manageable comparison. So adding together the total amount of state money that Minnesota dedicates to walking, biking, and safe routes to school, and dividing it by the state's total population adds up to 98 cents per person. So this earned them 3 out of 10 points, which suggests that there's some room for improvement there. And just to give you some scale, I know when I first saw the amount of money per person, I thought it was not a lot of money. We are giving 10 points, the highest amount for this indicator, as long as states are dedicating $3 per person. And again, if that doesn't sound like a lot to you, I will just offer a point of comparison, which is that the average per person spending, that average state per person spending on highways is $558. So it's not a lot of money. Then the third indicator in this section explores whether states prioritize high-need communities with the state funding they have available. Once again, Minnesota is doing a good job with this. So they receive 5 out of 5 points for considering high-need communities because Minnesota prioritizes rates of free and reduced school lunches in awarding Safe Routes to School funding through added points for schools with higher rates of free and reduced school lunches. And there's research that shows that this is an effective way of directing funds to high-need communities for Safe Routes to School. So some overall reflections on this section on funding. First, we'll talk about the federal funding reflection. So overall, the average score held steady, but nearly twice as many states now fall into the bottom third of scores. States in the Mid-Atlantic score above average, while the Southwest is below average. Scores for TAP, award, and obligation rates are improving. In 2018, only 10 states had obligated more than 61% of TAP funding, and this has grown to 31 states. But more states are transferring funds away from TAP. States transferring 40% or more grew from 6 states to 9 states. And states who use an equity consideration for their TAP funds grew from 16 to 21, and states providing matching funds grew from 13 states to 17 states. Then some reflections on the state funding. So it's important to note that we're not looking at trends with these data because it's the first year that we collected it. But one of our key takeaways is that states are putting up significant amounts of their own money. The state funding equals 56% of the TAP funding that's apportioned to states. States all across the country are funding active transportation, though patches of opportunity to improve exist all across the country, especially in the Southeast, Southwest, the Western Mountain region, and in the Northeast. And we are really pleased that we now have specific examples of how states are paying for active transportation and Safe Routes to School with their own coffers, as well as how they're operationalizing their commitments, which can offer concrete ideas and examples for other states on how to achieve those things. Now I will pass it back to Margo.
Sorry, we had a little double muting issue there. Thank you, Marisa. So we're going to talk about core topic area 3 now, which is Safe Routes to School funding and supportive practices. And as most of you are probably familiar with, Safe Routes to School is an initiative to make it safer for more kids to walk, bike, and roll to and from school. From 2005 to 2012, there was a standalone federal program focused on Safe Routes to School, and it's now been folded into the Transportation Alternatives Program, or TAP, which we talked about in the last section as well. States can use these TAP or other state dollars to fund Safe Routes to School. And the decisions that states make about how to prioritize and structure their funding and support for Safe Routes to School has an enormous impact on whether kids can safely walk and bike to school. While some of the elements of this section were included in the 2018 report cards, 3 of the indicators are revised and 3 are brand new. And you'll see from the map above that on the whole, 2/3 of the states fall into the bottom 2 categories, meaning there's a lot of room for improvement here. 21 states are in the lowest lacing up category, 12 are in the warming up category, 5 in the making strides category, and 13 fall into the top building speed category. We're going to look at New Jersey for this section, which landed in the second best category, making strides, with a total score of 24 out of 35 points. They're providing a lot of support for Safe Routes to School initiatives, but there are a couple of areas where we'd recommend they consider changes to their approach. As you can see, there are two subtopics in this area, and we'll go over each in a little more detail in the following slides. When you look at your own state report card, you can reference the full report for specifics on the points for each indicator. And actually, I misstated, my apologies, they actually are in the building speed category, just barely there, but they did make it. So the first subtopic area here is Safe Routes to School funding. We looked at 4 different factors to identify whether Safe Routes to School programs have the resources needed to operate effective and consistent programs. First, we looked at whether or not a state provides special consideration to Safe Routes to School projects when awarding their TAP funding. So as we talked about in the last section, TAP can fund active transportation and Safe Routes to School. And so some states have them all just compete in one big pot. Other states actually prioritize Safe Routes to School, either by setting money aside or giving these projects extra points. New Jersey got a 5 out of 5 here because they actually set aside $5 million of their TAP funding specifically for Safe Routes to School and run a separate competition. In the second indicator, we look at whether a state has created funding or used other federal transportation revenue for Safe Routes to School besides TAP. So for example, there's a federal program called the Highway Safety Improvement Program. So a few states have actually used that HSIP money and put it towards Safe Routes to School. New Jersey gets a 0 out of 5 here, as they don't have any other sources for Safe Routes to School besides the money that they set aside for TAP. Third, we look at whether a state funds Safe Routes to School programming, otherwise known as non-infrastructure, in addition to infrastructure projects. Programming, where you do things like run walking school buses, teach kids to safely bike and walk, those types of things, it is proven to make Safe Routes to School more effective than simply making the infrastructure improvements. So just adding a sidewalk alone isn't enough. You need to actually kind of change people's habits and get them to walk and bike more. New Jersey gets a 0 out of 5 here. While they do provide support on programming through their regional coordinators, individual schools and school districts are not allowed to apply for funding to support local programming or local staff to implement programs. And finally, the fourth indicator is new, and we look at whether a state provides planning grants or mini grants. And these are an easier way for new schools or low-income schools to get started with Safe Routes to School. So a planning grant, they might be able to identify what types of projects are needed in order to improve walking or biking. And a mini grant can let them, for example, start a walk to school day or a walking school bus and kind of get rolling. New Jersey gets a 2 out of 5 here because they provide planning assistance, but not mini grants. If somebody had both of those, they would get a 3 out of 3. And then the second set of indicators looks at supportive practices. So what types of support a state provides to Safe Routes to School programs. This type of technical assistance can help ensure that Safe Routes to School initiatives are based upon best practices and tailored to local needs. It can also help schools that aren't currently funded to implement Safe Routes to School programs. So once again, we look at 4 aspects here. First, we look at the level of staffing a state dedicates to Safe Routes to School, which could be state staff, coordinators of Safe Routes to School, or it could be consultants. New Jersey got a 5 out of 5 here because they have more than 2 full-time Safe Routes to School staff. They actually have approximately 12, which is quite impressive. Second, we recommend that states operate a resource center or provide technical assistance to communities that aren't funded to help them implement Safe Routes to School programs. New Jersey gets a 5 out of 5 here because they operate a statewide Safe Routes to School resource center that provides a lot of support and resources to schools. Third is a new indicator. We look at whether states provide technical assistance and support that helps local communities engage specific demographic groups, such as English learner students or students of color. New Jersey gets a 5 out of 5 here because they provide training and best practices on working with students with disabilities. And finally, we looked at whether a state has created any curricula or lesson plans to help integrate Safe Routes to School concepts into the classroom. And New Jersey gets a 2 out of 2 here because they have both K through 8 lesson plans on Safe Routes to School, as well as a bike-focused school curriculum. And, kind of reflecting on this section overall, We did see scores for Safe Routes to School declined since the 2018 report cards, but that's in part due to a change in the scoring and the addition of new indicators. The Mountain West and the West have above average scores, and the Southwest has the lowest average scores. We are pleased that more states are prioritizing funding for Safe Routes to School. The number of states that use state funding or other federal funding to support Safe Routes grew from 6 in 2016 to 13 this year, so almost double, or sorry, more than double in 4 years. And in addition, the number of states providing a TAP scoring preference or a set-aside to support Safe Routes to School grew from 17 in 2016 to 22 this year. So that's all great news. We also found that nearly half the states, 23 in all, have developed lesson plans or curriculum to extend the reach of Safe Routes to School into the classroom. And more than half, 27 in all, have at least one full-time person focused on Safe Routes to School, even though it is no longer required by law. We'd still like to see more growth there, of course. On the downside, 23 states still do not allow funding for Safe Routes to School programming or non-infrastructure using TAP, even though the research shows this makes the program more effective and gets more kids walking and biking. And we would also like to see more states providing support to help local programs reach underserved demographic groups. Only 13 states provide this type of support. And with that, I will hand it back to my colleague, Michelle.
Margo. All right. Our final core topic area looks at active schools and neighborhoods, and this is actually a section where we had combined 2 core topic areas from 2018 into one. So we had folded the state physical activity planning and support indicators into this core topic area. So turning from transportation to the policy and funding supports for kids and families to be active in their neighborhoods, having access to spaces for physical activity, and to be active at schools. Here's a map of the overall scores in this core topic area. You'll see that 16 states were in the lowest category of lacing up, or the yellow category. The vast majority were in the second category, that light green category. 2 were in the second to highest category, and then only 1 state was in the highest building speed, and that was California. So we're going to look at Arizona, which scored 24 out of 50 points in this core topic area, putting it in the making strides category. First, we looked at the policies around shared use of facilities. School shared use agreements open up playgrounds, fields, and facilities for recreational use by community members outside of school hours. And shared use policies provide places for physical activity and other community uses that can be especially critical in neighborhoods that lack parks, playgrounds, or community centers. While shared use agreements are made at the local level, supportive state policies and funding are 2 of the key ways to help overcome challenges with shared use. So our first indicator here looks at if the state has adopted a policy supporting shared use of facilities. State laws can make it more or less likely that a local school will agree to opening its facilities. To get 10 points, the state must have adopted legislation requiring schools to allow access to recreational facilities out of school hours. 0 points means that there's no legislation adopted. Here, Arizona got 6 points because it has legislation that recommends but doesn't require that schools provide access to their facilities. The second indicator here looks at whether a state provides funding or other incentives to support shared use facilities. Beyond having a supportive policy, states can provide an extra carrot or incentive, often through funding, to encourage local schools, cities, and other groups to work together to implement shared use. Here we awarded 5 points if the state does provide funding or incentives, and 0 if it doesn't. Since Arizona doesn't provide state funding or incentives for shared use, it received 0 points here. Next, we looked at school siting and design. These look at policies that states have that affect school siting decisions by local school districts. We have 2 indicators here. The first indicator involves a negative policy that many states once had that requires really inordinately large school sites. These requirements are known as minimum acreage guidelines, and these unnecessarily large sites not only drive up costs, but also means that new schools can't fit into neighborhoods where students live. They often need to be located on the outskirts of towns or in undeveloped areas where it makes it harder for students to be able to walk and bike to school. So in this indicator, states can really only lose points for this policy. Having this negative policy, they can lose up to 10 points if the negative policies affect elementary, middle, and high schools. Because Arizona doesn't have a minimum acreage requirements, it didn't lose any points here, and so the 0 here is actually really good. And then the second indicator looks at whether or not school siting, state siting guidelines include 4 factors that can support positive siting and design decisions by local school districts. We awarded points for each of the factors addressed, and these criteria include encouraging consideration of walking and biking, co-location of school sites with parks or community considerations, limiting the maximum size of a school site, and requiring a minimum amount of the school site be devoted to playgrounds and outdoor play and physical activity spaces. This indicator is worth 15 points. Arizona actually has all of these considerations within its school siting and design guidelines, so it received all of the points here. Next, in this core topic area, we turn to physical education. Strong physical education provides a really unique opportunity for youth to get regular physical activity and learn skills and habits that can keep them healthy for the rest of their lives. So this indicator looks at how many minutes of physical education are required for each grade range, and whether PE credits are required for high school graduation. So state laws and regulations can mandate that schools require students to meet the recommended minimum number of weekly minutes for physical education in their grade range. And these minimums are 150 weekly minutes for elementary school, 225 weekly minutes for middle and high schools. So the range of points are available for how close states got to requiring the recommended number of minutes for each grade level. So Arizona actually doesn't have requirements and got 0 out of 15 points here. So there's a lot of room for improvement. And then last, we looked at whether or not the state has staff at the state level that focus on physical activity. Dedicated staff means that there's more time spent on physical activity promotion, and that there's really state staff that has expertise in the area working on it. Arizona received 3 out of the possible 5 points here. The state has staff within the health department that focuses on physical activity, but they also have other responsibilities. So some reflections here. In terms of shared use, the number of states with shared use policies hasn't changed since 2018, and the number of states with incentives has stayed fairly consistent as well. This has fluctuated in individual states a little bit as different funding sources have changed. So although some states have eliminated funding incentives for shared use, an equal number have actually added funding incentives for shared use. In terms of school siting, this has also generally remained unchanged since 2018. There are 13 states that still have that large detrimental minimum acreage requirement. So that's something we'd really like to see changed. And then only half of states encourage consideration of those positive factors in school siting, such as considering walking and biking or co-location of parks. So that's also an area we'd like to see improved. This shows a map of the school siting indicators. This is an area where we see a great opportunity to change policy in those 13 states that are shown without the hatch pattern that have a detrimental large minimum acreage requirement. Looking at physical education requirements, again, no change since 2018 here. When we looked at the number of weekly minutes required and compared that to what the recommendations are, 19 states have required some number of weekly minutes. So there are also 41 states that required some physical education credits for high school graduation, but there's no state that required the recommended number of minutes, as well as in combination received all the points here. So there's clearly room for improvement for states in terms of having those physical education requirements that meet the recommendations. And then finally, with state staffing, the number of states with physical activity staff increased slightly, so it's a really good sign and good to see. some overall reflections and actions across all of the states and all of the core topic areas. We saw that you see from the original map, most states are still in the middle category. We had a slight downward shift in the overall scores, with 13 states falling into the lowest category and only 2 states in the highest category. So again, this may be due to changes in scoring, but also shows that there's a lot of opportunity for improvement. The good thing is, in every region of the country, there was at least one state with a fairly high score, and every state has taken at least steps in at least one area where it scored fairly well. But every state really has the opportunity to do more. So I mentioned that we have a couple of fact sheets on how to use your report card. We have one fact sheet that helps you understand the scores at a glance and has information about each indicator and the scoring. And then we also have a fact sheet on how to use your report card. So this has tips on how to use your report card, how to look at where your state could improve. We'd really recommend identifying 1 or 2 areas where there's room for improvement, and connect with partners and think about how you could encourage your state decision makers to make some policy changes. So with that, we have time for some Q&A.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Corey. I will be running the Q&A session, and we had a question come in about state funding. So state funding equaled 50%. Did state funding equal 50% of TAP funding in only those states, or in the entire national TAP funding?
Hey, this is Marisa. I can answer that. So there were 30 states that dedicated some form of state funding to active transportation and or safe routes to school. And we compared that, which totaled $430 million, to the total of all 50 states and the District of Columbia's national TAP funding. So to answer your question, is 56% of TAP funding for all the states, even those that do not have their own state funding.
Okay. We also had a question about states that are seeing a drop in gas tax revenues due to COVID and stay-at-home orders. Are you hearing how that may impact safe routes to school funding programs?
This is Margo, and I could take that one. And the first thing I'll say is that the data on funding for the report cards was collected pre-COVID. We finished the data collection in late February, right before COVID started taking off. So the report cards themselves do not reflect any of that. We would see that in our next set of report cards. However, I would say in general, it's too soon to see that impact, because the state gas tax revenues, they're being shored up at the federal level, because in one of the federal COVID relief pieces of legislation, they provided a big chunk of change to state departments of transportation to allow them to keep moving forward with projects. That may happen again in the package that they're working on that's hopefully going to get done this month. And the funding sources that we looked at are things that are kind of locked in already, and so we aren't seeing those being pulled back. We do see some impact happening at the local level. We are seeing cities and counties kind of stopping moving on locally funded transportation projects because they're more sensitive to the gas tax and local tax revenue changes.
Great, thank you. We have a question about school siting and design. What kind of school design guidelines can states work towards? And do you have any examples of what that would look like?
Yeah, this is Michelle. I can take that one. So if you look in the report cards and look in the section about the 4 factors that we looked at, we looked specifically for states providing some guidance around support for walking and biking. So considering where students live and their ability to walk and bike to school in the design and location of school sites. We also looked for guidance either requiring or encouraging a minimum amount of outdoor play or physical activity space. We looked at whether or not the state had a maximum, a requirement to keep under a maximum school site size. So ensuring that, school sites weren't not only weren't required to be very large, but also were required to remain, in a reasonable size. And then last, for co-locating with parks or community centers or other community spaces that would be beneficial as community destinations. So those are, 4 areas that we would like to see states provide some sort of guidance within that.
Great, thanks, Michelle. We have another question. Has there been any association, have you observed any association between better state report card scores and lower rates of childhood obesity in elementary school age children?
That's a great question. So for each of the indicators that we looked at, we really were looking at areas that we know there is policy strength, and we know that there's evidence that having these policies and practices in place help address physical activity rates overall. We have not done a specific study looking at the report card scores specifically and the rates of obesity or physical activity. And if there's a researcher out there who would like to take that on, we would love to talk to you.
Thanks. Another question. Do you know if having these report cards have had any impact in enabling positive change?
Yes, we do. We have seen states, as we look between 2016, 2018, and 2020, we have been able to see states that have adopted policies, and we've heard anecdotally from advocates as well as state employees and decision makers that looking at the report cards really caused them to think about specific areas that they could improve on, and have seen some policy changes since then.
Sorry, I'm just going through all the questions here. As schools are grappling with how to safely proceed with opening this fall, do you foresee that schools and parents will be more likely to rethink and encourage walking and biking to school rather than busing children within a certain radius of the school?
Yeah, this is something that we're really grappling with. Marisa, do you want to hop in with a little bit of what we're doing on the back to school working group?
Sure. Hi, this is Marisa. So yes, we know that the climate around back to school is tricky, and it varies state to state, varies district by district. So we are definitely concerned that parents will view driving their kid or their kids to school as like the safest mode. We see that as threatening a lot of the progress that we have worked to build over the last many, many years. So 2 things that we have been doing at the Safe Routes Partnership. So one is we pulled together a group of Safe Routes to School practitioners and advocates and school district professionals and city and local school district professionals to come up with some recommendations for each of the 6 E's of Safe Routes to School. And we considered 3 different scenarios. One was kind of what many of us have been doing since March, like the fully remote. We considered like back to school full time, and we considered a hybrid approach. And so this back to school work group has been in the process of developing recommendations and resources for each of those scenarios for each of the 6 E's of Safe Routes to School. And that has been led by Corey, who's moderating the Q&A, and our colleague Becky. And we will be releasing those recommendations by the end of July. And then the second thing that we've been doing, that we started yesterday, in fact, is hosting informal Zoom breakout group conversations for safe routes to school practitioners and parents and advocates to talk through some of these concerns. And in fact, we had 2 breakout groups dedicated to preventing, this shift back to the reverse, back to like parents just driving their kids. So there are definitely a lot of other people that are interested in talking about that and identifying ideas and strategies. And we have another one of those coming up on the 21st. So I can see if I can drop a link for that registration into the chat box.
Thanks, Marisa. We have another question going back to funding. So do the and the data collection process, do these indicators represent the same year, like such as 2020, or are they from different years, or are they a cumulative summary of several years?
Michelle, I'll answer generally that it varies by indicator. We tried to take the latest available data. So if you go into the actual report, you'll see citations for when the data was collected, or if it references another report or data collection, what year that was. It does vary.
This is Marisa. I can answer for the state funding for walking, biking, and safe routes to school. So we only included data that were funding that was in place as of January 2018. And I know when I was talking about that indicator, I shared that every state does this differently. Sometimes it's like a 16-year package or a 4-year package or a annual appropriation. And so we divided them up to figure out what the annual amount would be. But we were only considering funding that was in place from January 2018 on.
And this is Margo. I'll add for the federal portion and a lot of the safe routes to school indicators, those that were about practices or staffing are generally a moment in time. When we collected the data at the beginning of this year, what was their current situation, in terms of resources or staffing. Most of the federal funding is actually cumulative. So for example, for the Transportation Alternatives Program, what we're looking at is how much they've awarded since the program began in 2012, how much they've obligated since then. So again, as Michelle said, for each of the indicators in the report, it explains, how that data was collected and as of what time period.
Great, thank you. And we have one last question. Does Safe Routes Partnership or any other organization work with state coordinators to help them improve their scores, and what incentives can state coordinators have to improve scores?
Yes, and I was going to close by saying that if you want to talk about your individual state report card, we would love to speak with you. And I have our contact information will be included with the follow-up email, and it's also on our website. So feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to talk to you about your individual states and what you might be thinking about doing. In terms of incentives, I think it's really sort of internally driven within your state on a lot of times in terms of this is a national report card, so we want to see progress, and hopefully that incentivizes states to look at what they're doing and compare it to what's been happening across the country.
Well, and Michelle, if I could pipe in for a second, this is Margo. I would also think that if you're an advocate in a state where you think there is room for improvement, advocates can also provide that incentive to state departments of transportation as well. If you guys kind of work together and kind of create a campaign and have conversations with your state DOT about how it could be better, you can help create that incentive for them to make some changes.
Well, thank you, everyone. Again, this webinar is being recorded, so we'll send the link out as long, with the other information today. So feel free to share it or refer back to it again. We'll also be sharing a quick survey that really helps us understand what we're doing well and what could be improved with our webinars. So we'd really love your feedback. Please feel free to take that. And like I said, you can feel free to contact us about your individual state report card or any other questions. And thank you so much for joining us today.